Hello, this is Dr. Kate Antonova, Professor of History at the City University of New York, and you're listening to History in Practice. This is an introductory video. I'm starting here to give you a little background. I'm going to start with what is history, which is a surprisingly ill understood concept. You all think you know, and you all have different ideas. So we're going to talk about that first. There are different ways legitimately to see history that are all accurate. But the problem is really that everybody's using different ones and trying to talk about different things using the same word a lot of the time. And the kind of history I'm going to be talking about in here is not going to be so much the content. There are other channels for that. And there's lots and lots of books and history courses, including the ones I teach, for example, including books I've written. But what I want to talk about on this channel, the reason it's called History in Practice, is more about how we do it, how it impacts you and the rest of society, why it matters. So anyway, what is history in that sense? Well, it's not the first kind of meaning of history, which is the past itself. People often use the word history to mean what happened before us, right? Legitimate, but only one kind of way of thinking about history. History is also thought about often as our memory of the past, or what we collectively understand about the past. And that's what we mean when we say, for example, that history will judge. That as people understand our time in the future, they will think about it in a certain way. Is what we mean by history will judge, right? Well, for one thing, we really can't predict that. It really depends on the historians who are going to write that history and on what our society or whatever society exists after us will decide to think about us. And I don't think we can really predict that. I'll maybe have a whole separate video on history will judge. But that's generally not something that, it's absolutely not something academic historians talk about. History is also thought of as what I would describe as a history channel, aka Aliens channel, formerly the Hitler channel, very narrow pop culture version of history that is most accessible to most people and that a lot of people enjoy. And why not? Of course, no judging, but it's not the same thing as any of the other kinds of history I just talked about, or the kind of history I'm going to talk about. It's also the kind of history you see on PBS, right? On a documentary like Ken Burns' Civil War, or the books at Barnes & Noble, where they have a whole table of things marked history. Here I am, a historian. I go and look at that table. There's not a single book on there of any interest to me or related to what I do in any way. It's a completely foreign entity, that history on the table at Barnes & Noble. Yet again, that's what most people think of. And when most people, they hear I'm a historian, they say, oh, I love history. Often what they're thinking about is being a history buff, which means you really like the past. You like reading about the past. You like exploring things about the past, but generally not from an academic point of view. And that means different goals. Again, no judging. That's not necessarily, I'm not saying there's anything wrong, certainly not anything lesser even about any of that, but it's very different, very different. And I'll talk a lot more about that in this channel. Then there's history as in, Professor Binns and Harry Potter, the kind of history everybody had in school that was this boring, dry litany of names and dates. Most people think that's what academic history is specifically. It isn't, or it shouldn't be. It's definitely not how it should be taught. There are reasons actually that it's taught badly in many cases, although that's increasingly less true and less universal, hopefully. But we can also talk about why on another channel, another video, we'll talk about why that is such a cliche, and there's a lot of truth in that cliche as well. There's also the kind of history you encounter in museums and exhibits and historic sites and even reenactments. The kind of when people talk about making history come alive, and we want that when it's done well. It's really cool. And again, often people think, well, that's what historians should do, right? That's their job, and if they're doing it well, they're going to make history come alive. Nope, that's not what academic historians do. And by the way, the word historian, it can really refer to people working in many different aspects of history, and I consider them all my colleagues. But within history, historians broadly, there are very different backgrounds and kinds of training and kinds of goals. So I want to make clear what this channel is about, which is what I know, which was my training, which is I'm a PhD historian. I got a PhD from Columbia in, I don't really remember, 2007, I think it was. PhDs get so long that you forget. By the way, the average time to completion of a PhD in history is 10 years post-BA, post-graduation from college, 10 years. I took 7 or 8, I think. Again, one just wants to draw a veil over some of these things. So it's a very long degree. There's a lot of training. Part of what can take so long, and many people finish in more like 5 years if you're doing American history. Doing American history in the United States means your travel is domestic travel. It's much cheaper. You don't have to learn another language or translate your sources. There's still a lot of challenges. but that simplifies a lot of things. I did European history in Russia. I am not a native Russian speaker, so that travel, expense, and translation issues added years to the process. It can be even worse, for example, doing medieval history where you need to know medieval Latin as well as medieval versions of several European languages, like say French, Spanish, German. So anyway, we have different kinds of training. We do different kinds of things. We have different kinds of goals. So the kind of historian I am is a PhD historian or academic historian. Those are other ways to put it. That means that I did have to get this unique degree, a PhD, in order to practice as an academic historian. There are people who teach at the college level without a PhD, but generally they're not teaching and doing research. The sort of standard, if there's such a thing, definition of an academic historian is someone who does research and teaches. The proportion varies, but someone who does research and teaches. The point of college teaching is, and I have a whole other video about the history of higher education, but the kind of conceptualization of higher ed teaching as separate from high school, secondary school, is that higher ed teachers, instructors are also practitioners. The kind of joke about if you can't do teach is so completely stupid when it comes to college, because the entire point of college instructors is they do and teach. That college level education should be learning from practitioners. And in history, for example, that means we do research and we do teaching. There are variations on this, and in an individual instructor, I'll have another video about the different kinds of instructors and the different kinds of things that they do. But for the most part, as far as we can generalize, historians do research and then they teach their own research, but they also teach students how research is done, what academic history is, which is what I'm about to explain in this video, and why it matters, even if you're not a researcher, even if you're never going to read that particular research, even if you're never going to use that particular research, which may be true of all of you about my particular research. But what I can do and what I do every day in the classroom is teach what history is and how it matters. And in this case, I'm talking about academic history as distinct from all those other kinds of things I just mentioned. So academic history is not the past. It is not a recording of the past. It is not an individual's ideological take on the past. It is not a narrative of the past or a story of the past. It is none of those things. Academic history is the study of cause and effect, aka change over time. We study change over time. How does change happen? Causes and effects. Studying change also means studying continuities. Where some things are changing, other things are not changing, and that's change and continuity. So both together, just like cause and effect, are kind of two sides of the same coin. That's what historians study. When people talk about being a history major in college, it's been sort of traditional to say, well, very few of them will go on to be PhD historians, but some may write history from a sort of journalistic biographer kind of perspective. And for a larger audience, which is an admirable thing, to take academic history training and translate that to a much broader audience is fantastic. And many graduates go on to do that, but still a relatively small proportion. Many go on to law school. History training is fantastic training for law school, and I'll have a whole separate video explaining why. But also many history graduates go on to everything. The study of change over time is directly relevant to, for example, business and marketing. How do you want to know how change happens, i.e. how to grow your market, right? Or how to make your marketing more effective? How does change happen? How do you change people's minds? That's relevant to business, marketing, politics, obviously. But also anything, change over time. How does change happen? How do you make change if you want it to happen? What do you do if a change happens and the effects are the concern, right? And we would like to minimize bad effects and capitalize on good effects. Those are all the kinds of things historians study. We study these in a particular way because obviously once you get that general, you could sort of say, doesn't every academic discipline study change over time? And in some ways they kind of do, right? But we do it in a very particular way. First, we're studying change over time, not in like a cell, like in biology, or in fiction, like in literary studies, or in a foreign language or whatever, these other different disciplines obviously do. We're studying change over time in the past, right? Which includes every single thing that's ever happened anywhere in the world up to this moment, and now up to this moment, and up to this moment, right? It's everything. So we study everything. That seems extremely general. I've just made it even more general. But what we study, we're looking for particular context. History is very, very, very obsessed with context. A context, singular, is a particular time and place, a setting, and we usually mean particular groups of people within that particular setting. Maybe even an individual person, although increasingly modern academic history is about groups of people, aka social history. Like, for example, middle-class townspeople in medieval Europe, right? Medieval Europe is the setting, middle-class townspeople are the people we're studying, and then we want to know something about them and how that changes or doesn't change over time with what causes and what effects. That's an example of a historical question. We want to answer questions of cause and effect, but not, crucially, not in general reapplicable models of how cause or effect happens. For example, a question like what causes war? War in general, what causes all the wars, right? What are the list of causes of war? That's a political science question. What political scientists do, often studying some of the same subject matter as historians, like say any given war in the past, right? But what they're going to do is look for a pattern. They're going to look for a model that can be predictive of the future in some way. Presumably, why not? Why else do it, right? What historians are doing actually is different but complementary to that. We are studying particular wars. And one of the ways that academics often sort of make these distinctions is that one kind of approach are called lumpers and the other kind of approach are called splitters, meaning some people are lumping factors together to identify a pattern that can be generalizable and applicable beyond its one place you got it from, right? And you're actually going to get it from lots of different places to get a nice robust model, right? Splitters, which are mainly historians, splitters are people who are always wanting to make distinctions between one case and another case. And then within one case, make distinctions within that case and make even further distinctions, endlessly splitting to identify specific causes that are not, specifically, we want to find the ones that are not applicable anywhere else, the ones that are particular to this exact one context, that time and place and group of people or individuals. We are trying to distinguish the causes or effects of one particular case from another. This makes, for example, political scientists work better if they remember to rely on our work to start with. They're going to get better data input into their models, right? So in some ways we're like handmaidens to other social scientists who use our work, and the better our work is, the better their work is. But the other thing is part of the value of history is to poke holes in those models and to poke holes in the very concept of modeling itself. The social sciences, and I teach a class on what are the social sciences in our honors program at Queens College in the City University of New York. We talk about how the social sciences developed in the 19th century. Maybe I'll have a whole separate video on that as well. But the social sciences in general, and history is sometimes included in that group and sometimes lumped in with the humanities, like the arts, philosophy, and literature, right? And many historians will individually describe themselves as more of a humanist or more of a social scientist. I'm more of a humanist, for example. But history sits kind of uncomfortably in both. The other social sciences that are really definitional social sciences, one of the things they have all in common is trying to use rational and methods that are sort of constrained by rules, rational rules, to understand humanity and human behavior, which of course you cannot understand the same way you can understand biology empirically or math empirically. Human behavior is infinitely complex, so we can't understand it in the same strictly empirical way. There involves layers of interpretation, but in the social sciences and humanities, actually, those methods of interpretation are not random and they're not personal, they're not idiosyncratic, and they're not meant to be ideological. They are constrained by rational rules and are produced within a system of multiple people looking at the same problems. And that together creates, it's not the scientific method, but it is modeled on the scientific method, a different method that can work for systems that are infinitely complex and variable, unlike, say, math or biology or chemistry. So within the social sciences, the way they're doing that with all of social sciences, anthropology, sociology, political science, economics, those are sort of the biggies, but there's lots of others. They're trying to find models. What history does that's quite different, that sets us apart, that sets us both as kind of handmaiden to these other fields, but also as challenge to those other fields, that we're poking holes in those models that they're trying to apply. And we're finding the individual cases that don't apply and looking for the individual reasons where the models won't help us, and actually trying to sort of, while the general perception of history that most of you encounter every day are analogies of saying, you know, this is just like that event that happened 150 years ago. This election is like that election. For academic historians, that is exactly the opposite of what we want to do. It's wrong. It's a mistake to use an analogy, because for academic historians, the whole point of our study is to say each case is completely different from every other case, and we're going to understand them as individual cases where all the causes and the effects, the reasons for the change over time or the reasons for continuity are specific to this context. And then we're going to identify the very, very minute differences in context. What is different in this time, this place, these people, that distinguishes them from another and that makes the difference between this cause or that effect? Doesn't this seem maybe picayunish, that we're too obsessed with details? And what's the point of, aren't the models so clearly useful to find a model that could be predictive of the future? The problem is those models don't work. They usually don't predict the future. What we're trying to do instead in history is not only make those models better by making them more evidence-based, but also to sort of understand by minutely dissecting and splitting every single case. What you gradually do is get a better understanding of causation, the concept, as opposed to specific models of how a thing is caused, like a model of what causes wars, right? That's meant to predict what would cause future wars. What we do in endlessly poking holes at and of course, political scientists disagree on the answer to that, by the way, but we endlessly pick holes at that by showing examples that don't apply in order to understand in it the fullest complexity we are capable of grasping causation itself. What is a causal explanation? What allows us to pinpoint causes and differentiate them from effects? And by the way, any event in the past, even the smallest thing, is infinitely complex, is seen from multiple perspectives. And so we were never going to fully understand the causation. There is always multiple causal factors. There's no such thing as one causal factor. Historians argue a lot about the weight of one cause over another, but there's never just one causal factor. There's always multiple factors. As we're identifying all these multiple factors, what we're doing is we are systematically thinking through major logical puzzles, such as what are contingent causes, meaning this cause depends on another thing also happening. What are independent causes, meaning this has a major factor, a major effect on the outcomes we're looking at, regardless of what else is happening. We're making those kinds of distinctions, which helps us to better understand causation in general. But we're also identifying ways that various aspects of person, place, and time, people, places, and people and places in certain times make differences. So where the differences of a particular social group in the same time and place, for example, will react differently to different stimuli, resulting in different effects, right? That can teach us about how those kind of models work in general. What do we need to pay more attention to? What kinds of aspects of them are less predictive than others? All of those kinds of things are addressed by historical thinking. So the main value, in other words, of history as it's pursued in academia is partly the literal outcome of actual research. What do we find out about the past by endlessly reading and dissecting documents usually, but also objects and images and anything from the past is our evidence. We find out something and we try to write up our findings in narrative arguments about why causes and effect happened in the past. But of equal importance is the act of thinking this way itself. Thinking this way about the past helps us to think in certain ways about cause and effect, which can make us understand decisions better in the present. That's a kind of cliche, study of history, right? So you can understand your choices today. In fact, I have a t-shirt, I'll wear it in another video, from the Onion merch shop called about history. And it says, history sighs, repeats self, right? That's a cliche. That's not actually how historians look at the world. We do not think that studying a case in the past directly informs the future. What we think about is that thinking through similar or related past events clarifies our thinking, allows us to make finer distinctions, which is what higher order thinking is, about something else. It doesn't mean it's going to have the same outcome now. It doesn't mean that we should do what we did before that worked, or we should avoid doing what we did before that didn't work directly. It's not advice, direct advice that applies. What it is a heuristic or a sort of game or model, a practice of how to think that allows us to think more clearly and more effectively and more rationally in a more evidence-based way about something that's affecting us right now. And things that affect us right now, we tend to think less clearly about, right? We can think more clearly and more systematically about them by making sorts of comparisons. And that's what I'm saying. It's not an analogy when we talk about the past and the present. It's not an analogy in the sense of, you know, the Mark Twain quote, history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. Neither is really true. It doesn't rhyme either, but we do look to historical examples to practice thinking them through to reach a point of thinking clearly and rationally about something else where our understanding causation is much better. Does that make sense? I hope that made sense. That's what history is for academic historians. I'll stop here and I'll do a separate video on how we actually work.